one of the most overwhelmingly common pros of moving to the US is often cited by people as money. Sometimes people say it reluctantly because I feel like we've been trained as doctors that money is something we can't talk about. It's a dirty subject. We do this only for helping other people and, for the love of the profession. And you're not allowed to refer to anything in terms of finances as a reason for making your career choices. But I think everyone will admit in their heart of hearts that finances naturally do play a role in our decision making. And there is this idea out there that being a doctor in America means that you earn more money. But is that actually true? Yes, yes, it is actually true. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now of the specific differences in terms of some of the figures to put some more meat on the bone of that idea. So starting on kind of the broad scale terms, the average salaries for physicians. So there's a company called Medscape, which carries out an annual physician compensation report, which is a survey based where they send it out to physicians up and down the country in the US, and then they gather the data together and they let you know each year how the salaries have changed and what the average figures are. So the last one of these that was done was it was released in 2019, in March of 2019. And from those figures, the average salary for a physician, meaning a consultant in America, is $319,000 per year. Pause for the effect of that for the people watching this. So $319,000 a year is the average salary that a consultant gets in the US. Now, there are some regional differences and there are some differences based on your specialties. So if you were a primary care doctor, for example, meaning a GP equivalent in the US, that number is slightly different. If you're working in rural areas, so meaning if you're willing to go to Iowa or upstate New York or something like that, then your salary can be double what is the average salary for a comparative specialty area than if you are, for example, living in Manhattan, New York, just because they know that they have to pay people more to incentivize them to move to some of these other areas where they have shortages of physicians. So what about the trend of physician salaries? So I know that even up until back in, I think, 2008, when people were talking about there being Obamacare and the Medicare and Medicaid expansions happening, a lot of people thought that the gravy train was going to be slowing down in the US, meaning that the salaries that we'd heard about for years and years would actually be going down after that. The facts of the figures don't show any indication of that. So we have some data showing that from this same survey that was done back in 2011, the average salaries for physicians in the US back then was actually $208,000 a year. So that means that now, since 2011, for 8 consecutive years, the average salaries for physicians in the US have actually been going up each year. And they've reached now, as I mentioned, the $313,000 average. That is for the 2019 year. Within that, basically, it's broken down that the average salary for specialists is actually $340,000 per year. And the average salary for primary care physicians is $290,000 per year. There are differences I mentioned, so we have some visualizations for you to be able to show what are the comparative highest and lowest paying states. But as you can see here, even in the lowest paying states that they have in the US, those salaries are in the low $200,000 per year. So spare a thought for them. I really don't know how they survive. And just some figures to show you the salary ranges depending on the different specialties available. So in the latest report, you can see that the number one paying specialty for the last year was between orthopedic surgery and plastic surgery. And their average salaries were close to $500,000 per year. So that is averaged out throughout the entire country, meaning that some people that I know of even earn well over $1 million, and some people are closer to the $300,000 range of things. You can plan accordingly depending on your specialty of interest and get an idea of what kind of salaries you might be expecting if you were to move over to the US. So another set of charts that I found quite interesting to see was the percentage of physicians who thought they were fairly compensated. Things I found interesting here was that orthopedic surgery, even though it was like the number one paying specialty, only 50% of them thought they were fairly compensated for that. So clearly they're not content with the $500,000 a year. So let's hope that in the years to come, maybe they can get closer to what they feel like they actually deserve. So I really do encourage you guys to check out this Medscape survey. And the reason for that is it doesn't just give you information on salary facts and figures. It's a survey which asks other questions. And one that I found particularly notable was They asked the physicians who responded to the survey, what percentage of you would choose to do medicine again as a career? I want you guys to think from your own experiences. When you walk around the hospitals here in the UK and you speak to the consultants or the registrars here, maybe you have family members who are in this field, what percentage of them do you think from your experience have told you that if they had the choice, they would go back and still choose to be a doctor? Maybe I had a skewed experience, but from what I saw, I would say maybe it was in the 10 to 20% range. The majority of people would tell me, don't do this job, go do something else, save yourself while you can. I remember hearing when I was getting my work experience when I was in like year 10 or 11. So that was what I had been used to. And when I saw the figures from this report, it shows that it's broken down by specialty. So different specialties are more or less convinced that they would choose medicine again. But on average, you see that the numbers are within a range of like 65% up to in the 90% range of people saying that they would choose medicine again as a career. Now, I think that speaks volumes. It shows that the job itself, people find it rewarding, people feel like they're well compensated for it, and they have no regrets about choosing that as a career path. And I found that really refreshing to see, because even when I was out on my electives in the US, which we're going to speak about in more detail later on, I can say that my lived experience matches with these survey results. So I would walk around seeing happy doctors, seeing doctors saying they're really enjoying their work and having, effusive praise for their own specialties. And that was something which struck me as quite new, having gone from training in the UK. So I do think that's something that bears thinking about. How does this compare to the UK? I assume a lot of you are more familiar with the system in the UK, so we're not going to go into too much detail about this, but just looking at the figures themselves. So from the NHS websites, they have full transparency about what the compensation is for consultants. So from their website, they state that the average salaries of consultants in the UK range from £76,000 to all the way up to around about £105,000 per year. And that's based on the number of years that they've been a consultant. So as you progress through the years and you become more senior, your pay does increase. And also based on clinical excellence awards that can cause your compensation to be increased. I don't know how easy or hard those are to get, but the higher level you get with clinical excellence awards, you do get your salary supplemented a fair bit, but I don't think that is the norm. So in our calculations, we're not going to account for people who have achieved, very unique levels of success and clinical excellence awards. We're going to speak about the majority of consultants and what their salaries are. Now, of course, even consultants in the NHS or in England, they can supplement their earnings by doing private practice on the side, depending on their specialty and their geographical location. That's very difficult for us to standardize, and that's not something which we can anticipate as the norm for all consultants. So our calculations are going to be talking about the NHS salary rather than speculating about maybe private practice additional income that could or could not be coming in. So as you can see from this data visualization, you start out as a consultant making £76,000 per year, and based on the duration of time you've been a consultant up to a maximum of 14 years of experience, your salary does increase initially every year, and then as you move on through the years, it switches to every 5 years your salary will be increased. So ultimately, you'll reach that peak of around about £105,000 after 14 years of being a consultant. So if we're talking in chronological age, chances are that is when you're close to your late 40s, maybe early 50s, you can expect to reach that level of around about £105,000 if you haven't had breaks in your career. What about as a general practitioner? So as a GP, you have two different options. You can either be a salaried GP or you can be part of the ownership of a GP practice. So again, being part of the ownership of a GP practice is harder to standardize because a lot of your take home will depend upon the number of patients you have and things like various outcomes depending on which trust you're a part of and how their compensation schemes work. So the salary GPs earn on average between the mid 60,000s to the mid 80,000 pounds per year, and the private or being part of the ownership of a GP group, you tend to earn more. So I'd say closer to the 100 to 125,000 pound per year range, although it's hard to get exact statistics about that, as I mentioned. So trying our best to average out the different possibilities and the different levels of seniorities in the UK, we reach an average expected salary as a consultant in the UK of close to, say, £92,000 per year. If we're being quite generous and assuming that, using the being a consultant for around about 10-year range and reaching £92,000 and averaging out the general practitioner salaries. So the average salary you can expect to get as a consultant in the UK is around £92,000, which equates in dollar amounts to $122,000 per year. So as comparison, we have on the one side in the UK, the average salary is around $122,000 per year as a consultant. And in America, as a consultant, the average salary is now around about $313,000 per year. So as you can see, that's a pretty big difference. It's not quite 3 times as much, but it's pretty close to triple the pay that you can expect to get as a consultant in the US. Now, one thing this doesn't take into account is how long it takes you from when you graduate from medical school until when you become a consultant. And that is obviously going to impact how many years you're earning that consultant salary. So looking at the UK first, depending on the specialty you choose and depending on the location where you want to practice, it can take anywhere from 5 years after graduation to become, for example, a GP, all the way through to maybe 10 to 14 years after you've graduated medical school to become a consultant, say, dermatologist in London. And the breakdown of that is that, the F1, F2, the core medical training years, and the specialty training years, combined with the fact that most consultant jobs here in London now for specialties like dermatology actually require you to have a PhD to be competitive for those posts. So that in itself can take an additional 3 to 4 years. So I have some example, lengths of time that it can take depending on the different specialties you can choose and how long that'll take you to become a consultant on average. And these numbers are assuming that you never get stuck at any bottlenecks. You don't go a year without getting your specialty training number, for example, and at the end of your training, you go straight into a consultant job immediately, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, is pretty rare these days. There does tend to be a bottleneck when you finish your registrar training until a consultant job opens up. But we're going to be generous and assume that you're going to fly straight through all of those different applications and go straight into work. So as you can see, some example lengths of training that you can use for your calculations. And what I've also done is I've put the comparative length of time it takes from starting your residency in the US to when you become a consultant over there. And as you can see, it's a pretty big difference in most specialties. So taking dermatology as an example, because that's what I know, and also I mentioned that it can take up to 10 to 14 years there to become a consultant here in London, should I say. Over there in America, obviously getting the residency is the tough part, which we're all working towards right now. But assuming you start residency training, it actually only takes you 4 years from when you start residency training to when you become a board certified dermatologist, and therefore you're a consultant who can practice independently and earn the types of salaries that we talked about earlier. So what I argue is that you have to take into account the opportunity cost, meaning when you stay in the UK, you're potentially delaying your start to earning that consultant salary by anywhere from 5 years to up to 10 years, depending on the specialty of choosing. So what that means is if we average it out and we take those average salaries we talked about earlier, a consultant salary in America versus here, and we say that you take an additional couple of years of training here in the UK. If we do some, back of the envelope math, it can show that after around about 9 years after medical school, after graduating medical school, if you were to take somebody in the US versus somebody in the UK who had chosen a specialty like dermatology, the differences in earnings, even after around about just 9 years, so under 10 years, the differences in earning can be around about $1 million. So that's something else which you have to factor in is how much earlier are you starting to earn that additional salary in the US as compared to in the UK. But are there not bottlenecks when it comes to residency training and getting jobs in the US, I hear you ask? There really aren't, to be honest. And I think the reason for that is just because there are so many different diverse options for employment in the US. Here in the UK, when you finish your specialty training, very few people will go immediately from being a registrar to only doing private practice. You generally have to get a consultant job as a doctor affiliated with a local institution. And what that means is there can be a pretty long wait until one of these consultant jobs open up, because there'll be somebody, for example, who's the orthopedic surgeon at the local hospital in Basildon, for example. And if you're a trainee in that area, you're basically just waiting for that person to retire or, God forbid, pass away. And that is basically, it's quite morbid, but that is the only opportunity you will have to then get that consultant job in the area you want. Take the equivalent in New York. Now, when I finish my residency training, which will be in around about a year and a half, my employment options are, yes, academic institutions such as, Mount Sinai Hospital or Cornell or NYU or Columbia, but it's not just those hospitals. I could start my own private practice immediately, and that is the norm for the majority of people. Or I could take up a job in one of these multi-specialty groups, or even a medi-spa, and there's just 100 different options of places where you can start your consultant career. So what that means is there's not a single person who will be stuck, for example, being a board-certified dermatologist, but just waiting around and not having a job offer ready for them. In fact, on average, you will field between 100 to 150 consultant job offers during your final year of residency training in the US. So you really don't need to worry about whether or not there'll be a job for you. It's about you choosing the one that works best for you. So I think now is a pretty good time, having mentioned all of these different salaries and how lucrative it can be. I think now is a good time to mention back that that cost of all of the exams that we calculated in the entire application process, around about, in total $15,700. Back then I told you, it's an investment, and that sounded like something just to make it go down a little bit easier because it's such a massive amount of money. But I think having now discussed the differences in salaries and how much earlier you can start making that money, I think it's a little bit easier for you guys to see what I mean when I mentioned that money, it really is just an investment. And it's something which, if you're serious about it as a future career option, it's going to pay abundant dividends.